And thank you for this wonderful invitation. I have witnessed the growth of MiRoR and all the wonderful accomplishments that this coalition of superb researchers and young scientists has accomplished over the last few years. And it's a great honor for me to be part of this celebration today of what MiRoR has achieved, and to discuss some thoughts about what can we achieve with meta-research in its different ramifications. Now, meta-research is a term that some people like and other people find a bit esoteric. That meta component could be translated in different ways. It could be comparable to metaphysics, so maybe getting a little bit outside science. It is as well integrated with science as it can be. In a way, it's a very old discipline. It's pretty much the study of the scientific method that has been with us for many centuries. What it encompasses is different aspects on how we apply the scientific method and how we try to make sense of it. So aspects of methods, or how to perform research, aspects of reporting, how do we communicate research and science at different levels within science and also beyond science to other stakeholders who are interested, affected, or may affect science. Reproducibility, how do we verify what we do? The very basic question of how do we know that we're right, or how do we know that we're wrong and we need to do something different? Evaluation, which is becoming more and more critical because we are all struggling to survive in a very competitive world, and ideally we want to make sure that we evaluate science in a way that we are fair and that we find the best possible science to promote and disseminate in our journals and through funding processes. And finally, incentives, which is a continuation of that. How do we eventually incentivize the best methods, the best processes, the best practices, the best way of arriving to the truth more efficiently with minimal waste, and selecting the best people and the best institutions who can do that? There are many related disciplines to meta-research, and I think all of them can offer insights, empirical evidence, and stories of success and failure on what they have done already. Some of them have a history of hundreds of years, others are more recent. For example, history and philosophy of science, or epistemology, is a neighborhood type of discipline. Some people have argued that meta-research might need to be called empirical epistemology. I have some reservations about that, but it's one possibility. And what I like about that term is that both words are Greek. Psychology and sociology of science is also a field that has had a history of several decades. Robert Merton was a giant and set the foundations of what science should be about. A few months ago, I was one of the inaugural speakers for the Robert Merton Center for Science of Science in Berlin. Statistics. There's lots of statistics, lots of good statistics, lots of poor statistics, and lots of insights about statistical methods. Data science. Many statisticians feel that there's no such thing. Many data scientists feel that that's the only term that should be used. Are these different disciplines? Again, lots of opportunities with more and more data to inform science empirically. Informatics, evidence-based medicine. I'm preaching to the converted. Probably I see some of the giants of evidence-based medicine in the audience. Research synthesis methods. Meta-analysis has a long history of about a century. In the last several decades, it has acquired tremendous visibility with over 100,000 meta-analyses that have been done that can offer us insights about what we can learn from integration of evidence, of good evidence and poor evidence. David Moher's journalology, the study of publishing of journals and what can go wrong there, another very fertile field. Scientometrics and bibliometrics, another field that has published tens of thousands of papers. Organizational and operations research, ethics, research integrity and accountability research, communication sciences, policy research, behavioral economics. The list is very, very long. And I think that meta-research has used tools and some of the experience of all these fields to try to integrate them into a larger whole. What would that larger compilation look like? This is the universe of science. It contains currently about 160 million published items, and it's growing at a rate of 5 to 6 more million added every year. It's a very complex universe, and I think that the common denominator of that universe is that all these different galaxies, all these different star systems are interested in using the scientific method. However, there's about 500,000 scientific disciplines. And the way that they use the scientific method may not necessarily be the same. In a way, learning about these other disciplines and what they do about their application of the scientific method is a little bit like trying to get in touch with extraterrestrial creatures. And sometimes I feel like an extraterrestrial creature when I meet a scientist from a different domain and he tells me that, by the way, this has been done. Oh, okay, I didn't know about that. Maybe we can use it in other fields as well as a way to improve science. There's an error in that map, and it's pointing to what I think might be my best paper. My best paper is a speck of dust in a speck of dust in a speck of dust somewhere around here. Why am I showing this? Because most science is organized in ways that we try to focus. I'm not saying that this is necessarily bad, but in a way, meta-research is trying to do the opposite. It's trying to zoom out. Instead of focusing on something very, very small and specialized and over-specialized, in meta-research, typically we're trying to take zoom-out views, bird's-eye views of larger domains, larger disciplines, seeing multiple such solar systems in comparison, multiple galaxies, try to get some sense about common threads and common features and common threats about the scientific method and the way it's implemented. Of course, these different galaxies are not the same. There are major differences across different fields. There's differences in the degrees of determinism. There's differences in the signal to measurement error ratio. Some scientists are working in fields that have tremendous noise unavoidably. It's not that they're worse in their ability to come up with reliable discoveries. It's just that the odds that they're facing are much more harsh compared to others. The complexity of designs and measurement tools sometimes aligned to what we try to get, but very often probably misaligned with what we try to get. I've seen many situations where somehow some designs have been embedded into the mainstream research of a field that they don't necessarily lead to efficient modes of investigation. Closeness of fit between the hypothesis and the experimental design and data. Some fields would be very disappointed if they're off by 0.0001%. For example, if you try to estimate avocado's number, then that error would be unacceptable. Other fields would be very happy if they're in the ballpark of a log scale type of approximation to the magnitude. The statistical and analytical methods that are used to test hypotheses, or even whether hypotheses are specified, there's tremendous variability. Again, some of that may be commensurate with the types of questions that the field is trying to address, but very often it is something that has been taken over without much thought, probably more by custom, and people perpetuate statistical methods that are very inefficient or even inappropriate for answering the types of questions that are being posed. What is the typical heterogeneity of research results, and what do people think about heterogeneity? Is it something that is desirable? Is it something that is thought to be a manifestation of bias? Is it something that is thought to be interesting to pursue because it leads to new discoveries and new explanations? How big is big heterogeneity in a given field? Culture of replication. do people want to do replication studies? In some fields like genetics, currently, if you don't do replications, you don't have a chance to be published in a leading journal or even in a modest credibility journal. In other fields, replication is seen as me too research to be avoided at all costs. There's no resources for that, and no one wants to do it. Transparency, the culture is very different. Some fields want to be transparent. They have realized that it's very important to share, to be open. Other fields are operating in a stealth mode. Some fields are even feeling that this secretive mode is something that they should be proud of, because it allows them to just do their work and get it done, and nobody knows how it has been done. Accumulating knowledge. We have about 100,000 meta-analyses that have been published across science, but some fields are concentrating the vast majority of them. Many fields in biomedicine are publishing meta-analyses like crazy. There are fields that have published 200 meta-analyses on the same topic and still keep going, publishing more of them. And there's many other fields that very few or even no meta-analysis have been done. Why is that? Why is that different approach to the accumulation of knowledge? What are the criteria for claiming truth? And does the field even have such a set or some agreement on what are we going to use to decide if we have reached where we want to reach, whether we should continue investigation, whether we should abandon that field? Even fields that use similar type of statistical tools, they may differ enormously on whether they account for multiplicity, for example, whether a p-value of 0.05 is enough or slightly less, or they want to go for p-values of 10 to the minus 9 or even smaller. And finally, what are the purposes to which findings will be put in the consequences of false conclusions? Some fields are very esoteric. They are just blue sky science. They do all the work because of curiosity. And other fields are dealing with life and death, with decisions that would affect millions of people and will have an immediate practical impact on our lives. What we have documented over the years is that even though there's such tremendous heterogeneity in how science is run across disciplines, a common denominator is that many scientists feel that it can be done better. That there are ways that we can improve the way that we perform our research and the way that we try to get to that quote-unquote truth. In biomedicine, this is very obvious because even though biomedicine does make progress, there's no doubt about that, probably this progress is pretty slow. This is some empirical data that try to understand how long it took from the first discovery of a concept, an idea, to developing a human intervention out of it, tested in humans, and then having a randomized trial showing that that intervention does work in major ways in humans, or some other study that equally made that claim that this is something that can save lots of lives. And that milestone of this extremely highly cited study is the red data point here, and these are the most cited papers across the history of biomedicine. You can see how long it took. On average, it took about 25 to 30 years. In some cases, it took 200 years. Even when we reach the point of having such a big discovery validated with a large study with clinical implications, about 40% of the time, within a few years, there was an even better, larger study that claimed that what we had claimed was wrong. So there is an issue of taking too long, and an issue of even when we get there, when we get at the end of the journey, if there's ever an end of the journey, very often we have reached the wrong city, we have reached the wrong target. So meta-research is interested on expediting that process and in also reducing the chances that we will reach the wrong destination. This means that we care a lot about reproducibility. And many of the efforts in meta-research have focused on trying to transform how can we improve reproducibility. All 22 major fields of science use the term reproducibility more often over time. If you look at the term, for example, reproducibility of results, this is the plot of how often people mention these terms, and it's a geometric growth pretty much affecting all 22 major fields of scientific investigation. However, there are obstacles to reproducibility. And I have tried to summarize these obstacles with two stereotypes. They do not pertain to any particular study that is horrible. They pertain to most studies that we do, most studies that I do, for example, are affected by these stereotypes, and they kind of give a sense of why there's plenty of room to transform the way that we do science. The most typical recipe is the recipe of small data. Science is done by many millions of investigators. Recently, we tried to analyze the citation profile of every single investigator publishing any paper in science. We found 35 million authors who are publishing. Some of them probably are just wrong ID, not merged with some larger record, but probably we have 25 million authors who work in science. We have very limited funding. Our society invests very little to science compared to what science is worth and what science can accomplish. This means that each one of us needs to try to work with very limited resources and therefore tries to be competitive with small samples, with what can be done with these limited resources. Most of the investigators working with small samples, they have a small lab that is working behind closed doors or behind a closed computer that no one else can see, a small team. They're pretty much solo and siloed. They need to convince the rest of the community, funders, reviewers, that they are producing interesting science, that they're making great discoveries, and therefore in the next funding cycle, which is in 4 years, sometimes 3 years, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 1 year or 5 months or 3 months, or in the next monthly report, they have discovered something great. If you need to discover something great in every monthly report, or at the least every 4 years, it means that a lot of cherry picking will happen of the best looking results. Most of that will be done post hoc, unavoidably. Most of that will be done with a consensus in the rest of the community that very lenient rules of claiming success will be utilized. So a p-value of 0.049 will be considered to be enough. There's no registration. Registration will probably make things worse and even impossible in many situations in trying to claim that something new has been discovered based on that recipe. No data sharing, because data sharing is just offering ammunition to the competition, so it's something to be avoided. And of course, no replication, because replication would mean spending double the time and getting a result that in most fields it will be something like 90% likely to just invalidate the original results, so then people feel that they're back to square zero. We've seen that pattern operate in multiple fields. We've seen it embedded in the way that science is run in fields as different as neuroscience, psychology, and medicine. Most of the results come from very small studies. Most of the results come from studies that are grossly underpowered. Grossly underpowered means lots of false negatives, but also lots of false positives. And with a tiny bit of bias, the rate of false positives can very quickly escalate. The second recipe is the recipe of big data. And in an increasing number of fields, it is starting to complement or even replace the recipe of small data. Big data are becoming easier and easier to collect. They collect themselves very often without us doing anything. They keep growing and accumulating while we're sleeping. We wake up in the morning and there's millions of new observations in the data set that we can access and we can work with. This means that sample size is no longer an issue, or actually it is an issue from the inverse. All of these studies now are tremendously overpowered. Anything that you test is a little bit like King Midas touching and everything becoming gold. Everything is statistically significant, which means that again one needs to cherry pick. What is the best looking narrative? It's impossible to say that everything is significant. You need to make a narrative, you need to isolate something that would be more earth-shaking and more interesting to communicate. A lot of that work is still done post hoc in lots of these databases like electronic health records or lots of omics tools that are accumulated with no specific research plan on what to expect in particular. There's more fancy statistics involved. However, they tend to be idiosyncratic. Many of these big data disciplines have grown out as isolated pockets of researchers who have accumulated more researchers around them. Somehow, some knowledgeable or less knowledgeable, informed or less informed people have decided that one particular tool needs to be used for statistical inference. That tool tends to be embedded. When you compare notes between two different fields that should have used the same statistical tools because the inferential machinery and the types of questions are the same, you see that they're very different. And it makes no sense that they should be different. There's very little consensus that permeates multiple fields that may be using different phenotypes of data sets. Most of that research is still done without any registration. Actually, I would say that the rates of registration here are probably even lower, and many people would vehemently argue that registration is not indicated because that research is exploratory. So we should just aim to say that we're doing exploration and this is it. And finally, there is more data sharing because data sharing is easy. These data cannot go away much of the time. They are just there, and they can be shared, not always, but sometimes. The problem is that we don't really understand what exactly is being shared. Sometimes even the people who have worked the most on these data do not understand what are these data and what do they mean, what is the validity of the variables, how much trust we can put on them. And even those who have designed the collection of data sets very often probably do not pay enough attention to making these data sets work in the hands of other people. They tend to be very complex, so one would need to invest a lot of time to make them translatable and usable, even with very simple means, like just having a code book that would be readable by other people. In my experience, most of the code books that I get are a bit unintelligible, like a foreign language, that you really have to engage into lots of back and forth with a primary investigator. Many fields are going through a period of soul searching, and that soul searching is manifested in different ways, but I think it's one of the key tools that we have to transform the way that we do science. Psychology is a paradigmatic example. You have all seen that great paper by the Open Science Collaboration with 271 psychologists and their teams trying to reproduce 100 papers published in 3 of their top journals. And of course, you can read the results in many different ways, but in roughly 2 out of 3 of these studies, the original data do not seem to square with the reproducibility data. Does this mean that the original was wrong and the replication was correct, that the original was correct and the replication was wrong, that both of them are correct, but somehow we missed to understand what are the key features that drive the results, even though everybody paid a lot of attention to make sure that the original and the reproducibility would be as close as possible? Could it be that both are wrong? And are these questions having the same answers in different fields? Probably not. There's more such efforts that are ongoing and completed. Last year there was another effort on reproducibility of papers published in Nature and Science. 21 papers, the results did not look much better. Roughly the effect size in the reproducibility effort was 50% of the effect size in the original effort. Some fields probably are doing or have done much worse. For example, genetic epidemiology of the Candida gene era, which includes about 40,000–50,000 papers, apparently has a replication success rate of 1.2% when compared to much more rigorous methods of chasing genetic associations in the Karen era, where we use genome-wide analysis, very stringent statistical processes and thresholds, and openness as the default, and replication as the default. How many fields have replication rates of 1%? We don't know, because most fields have not tried that. I think that there is some sense of uneasiness in going in that direction. It's a brave step when a field decides that now it's about time that we try to take a step back and look at what we're publishing and try to get a sense of calibrating the credibility of our work. Preclinical research has also faced a lot of challenges with reproducibility. Multiple efforts here were led by the industry. And why is that? The reason is that the industry has every reason to want to not waste $500 million or $1 billion for developing a candidate drug target that has been proposed by top academics in the best academic institutions into a drug that eventually doesn't work. And this has happened in their hands again and again and again. So at some point they said, we want to tell you that story, that we use the very best papers coming from the best teams in academic environments. And it just doesn't work for us. The success rate in different series that have been published range from 0% to 25%. And obviously all of that led to lots of soul searching, but also an impetus for changing the way that we do that research to try to improve the credibility, to try to transform the chances that we will get it right next time. That process of transformation has not been necessarily smooth. Whenever there's an issue of proving that a study is wrong, there's potential for friction. When I say to you that there's millions of studies that are wrong, nobody will notice. You will be sleeping while I say that. But if I tell you, your study is wrong, that person who I pointed to will probably notice, and that you get what is the reproducibility wars. Reproducibility wars means that we have a lot of emotion about trying to be correct, and even more emotion when we're told that something that we've done is wrong, let alone when that comes along with some allure that actually this is fraud. This is, you're a horrible scientist, you're unethical, and this is why you got it wrong. It is perhaps a pity that the most dominant field when meta-research started becoming a fashionable field was research integrity. So in the early years, it was very difficult to differentiate what was fraud, like plagiarism or falsification, creating studies that don't exist, describing patients that never happened, and studies that have not occurred, from the vast majority of questionable research practices or inefficiencies or problems in methods or problems in ways that would be avoidable, but it needs a lot of care that are very different from these. However, the reproducibility wars, I think, are gradually abating, and I think that more people realize that we can all get it wrong. I'm sure that I have published zillions of wrong papers and zillions of wrong results, and I hope that someone will correct them one day. This is what science is about, trying to correct mistakes and inefficiencies and things that are not optimal. So how do we do that? There's many different types of interventions, and about 5 years ago, I tried to put them together into 12 different families. So these are the 12 families: large-scale collaboration and team science, adoption of a replication culture, registration of studies, protocols, analysis codes, data sets, raw data and results, sharing of data, protocols, materials, software, and other tools, reproducibility checks and reproducibility practices, containment of conflicted sponsors and authors, more appropriate statistical methods, standardizations of definitions and analysis, more stringent thresholds for claiming discoveries or successes, improvement of study design standards, improvements in peer review, in reporting and in dissemination of research, and better training, continuous training throughout the phases of growth of a scientist, of the entire scientific workforce in methods and in statistical literacy. We have some evidence that some of them work in some fields, and we lack evidence about their effectiveness in many other fields. We also have very limited evidence on how exactly to transform a field and what are the best steps from moving from one paradigm to another paradigm. However, the question is whether we can take the best success stories and see what is their potential to transplant them into other scientific domains or to optimize them in domains where they already show to have promising results. Team science and large-scale collaboration has been successful in many entities, ranging from genetic epidemiology, like the slide that I'm showing here, to experimental physics. You can imagine what would have happened if instead of giving CERN to 30,000 physicists and telling them, you need to do your best now with this huge data that all of you can have access and which you can replicate routinely, and you can work in teams and you can share everything among them. Instead, we were following the medical paradigm where we would ask these 30,000 people to compete. We will give them funding for 3 years, just a little bit, so they can probably measure a few protons and a few electrons, and we tell them by the end of 3 years you need to discover a boson, otherwise you will not be funded next time. Probably we would have discovered about 30,000 bosons, and I think many of us would have discovered many bosons to be even more funded. Only one was discovered, but I think that this is great news because that's very credible, highly reliable, there's no doubt about it. Standardization of processes is something that a field that coalesces is likely to achieve far more easily. This is a contrarian example of a field that I work with Rebecca Merton from Stanford. She was working with me at Medsix and also doing a PhD in stem cell and neuroscience research. And we tried to ask how many protocols are out there that are evaluating the transformation of stem cells into dopaminergic neurons. Tremendous potential eventually for that path of research to affect the treatment of diseases like Parkinson's disease. About 100 protocols are out there. They don't really seem to communicate with each other. They differ in minute details most of the time. Most of them are abandoned. There's no sense in the field that one is trying to develop the best protocol, joining forces and trying to say that, well, we have learned out of that experience and now we can really propose what would be the best way to move forward. Registration is another hotly contested issue, but I think that it has proven that it can transform many fields of science, some of them very far apart from each other. Some people feel threatened by registration, especially in fields of exploratory science. They feel that more registration would mean that somehow they would need to specify ahead of time everything that they will do, while they don't really know what they want to do. They are in an iterative process, they are in a forking path process, and this is entirely legitimate if it's just exploration in the dark. I think that we need to secure that for a lot of science, no registration should be implemented, but it should be very clear that this is exploratory research. That should be with bold letters in the very beginning. We just went into the dark. We had no clue what we would find. We had no clue where we were heading, but we stumbled upon this, and it looks interesting. Could someone now register a protocol to try to see if they can replicate it? There's other levels of registration, like registration of data set, which I think could be something that many fields would benefit even without registering specific ideas and specific protocols. Registration of data sets is something like registration of nuclear armaments. It's like telling you that I have that data set in my computer. It includes so many variables and so many observations that tonight, if I press a button, chi-square, I will launch 5 trillion p-values against you within a split second. It's good to know about that nuclear capacity, and I think that many fields do not really know how many data sets, how much data is out there available. A number of years ago, I started asking the best epidemiologists in the world, do you know how many epidemiological studies are out there? And of course they said, how big? And I said, let's say more than 10,000 people. Nobody had a clue. Of course, I had no clue. I started trying to compile those with colleagues at NIH. We are already collecting more than 1,000 such studies. I estimate that there's more than 10,000 such studies. And most of the time we just see one of them coming up with a blip of a significant result for some very weird association. Registration of protocol goes a further way if there is a protocol. And I think that this is the standard norm. This is what's happening for randomized trials, but it can be expanded into many other fields. Registration of the analysis plan is something newer, because a protocol most of the time does not include an analysis plan, and I think that the analysis plan can really make a huge difference compared to the very same protocol that can be analyzed in very different ways. Analysis plan plus raw data, open live streaming, more and more openness would be more advanced options that are adopted in some fields, and I will show you some more data about that type of sharing. Sharing data, I think, is something that many fields should try to make the norm. It is not the norm, of course, I realize that, but increasingly many communities realize that they will not be able to make progress unless they do that. A few months ago, along with 70 other colleagues, I joined in that policy forum in science. I'm the corresponding author. Probably people thought the corresponding author has the highest chances of being assassinated. Let's pick John for that. I think that what we try to say here is that data sharing should happen for everything, and it should precede the rights of the data originator. The data originator in many fields can only generate a small slice of the data, and having that person try to analyze that slice of data first, have the first rights, is really wrong, because he or she will get it wrong having just a tiny bit of the larger universe of information. The best thing is to just give that information to the rest of the community, and then a communal effort using the best analytical tools for the entirety of the information is likely to yield the most reliable results. This means that if we move in that direction, we need to dissociate from the paradigm of what we do now, where the data originator sees that data, publicly funded data, is a private gold mine to build a career on, to a situation where data production is one type of work that you get credit for. Data analysis is another type of work that you get credit for. Data reuse is another type of credit. There's many types of credit, and instead of thinking that there's only one way to do it, we should think of how movies have at the end of their titles all the list of people who have contributed in different ways. The current paradigm of scientific investigation is asking each one of us to be a director. So you end up having situations where you have 500 directors, authors, in papers that have 500 names on them. And you know that this is impossible. You know that there's no way that these people can satisfy Vancouver criteria. Instead of that, we should be very clear, yes, there were 500 people. Perhaps there were 1,000 people, 5,000, 50,000 people who worked on a project, but this is what each of us did, and this is what the relative contribution was, and one should get credit for that. I think that if we move in that direction, we avoid the tension that was created, like, for example, from the former editor of New England Journal of Medicine, who said that those who use other people's data are like parasites, and then, of course, he had to withdraw that. Data are what science depends on, but there's really no ownership in most of the cases. How much sharing is happening, and how much sharing can be induced? I'm not very optimistic for already existing data, and this is one situation where we tried to unearth existing data for sharing with a wide scientific community. Along with Tom Hardwick, we asked the corresponding authors of papers that had accrued the largest number of citations in the last 10 years in psychology and psychiatry to share their raw data, and we promised, with no money, with no funding, we requested nothing else from them, to curate them and make them available widely for everyone. Very few people did that. Some had already shared their information, but not many more did that. And these are the reasons why this did not happen. Most of the time, the data were outside the researcher's control, or there were legal, ethical, consent issues that this could not happen. It's very difficult to change the consent afterwards, and it's very difficult to make a primary investigator, a principal investigator, own the data that he or she has never owned in his or her life. In many cases, this might have been, for example, industry studies where the principal investigator never owned the data, never saw the data, probably never did the analysis, just saw the analysis and then looked at them and put his or her name on that. So it's very difficult to go back and change a paradigm that was probably malfunctional in the past. In some cases, people get alerted because we often get hold of some of the old data and then someone reanalyzes them, like in the case of study 329, and we get a completely different result. The original trial had suggested that paroxetine and imipramine are very effective and safe for treating adolescents with depression. 15 years later, When independent scientists got hold of the same data, they concluded, looking at the very same results, that imipramine and paroxetine are not safe and they're not effective in the very same trial. In another empirical evaluation where we looked at every single situation where someone had reanalyzed existing data for randomized trials, we found that 35% of the time it was a pretty similar situation. The conclusion of the reanalysis was different compared to the conclusion of the original analysis. Who did these reanalyses? Most of the time it was the original authors. What's wrong here? The original authors discrediting themselves? Not exactly. The original authors trying to get a second publication, and they would not be able to do that unless they said that they found something different. Very confusing, but this is the way in the past environment to really be able to use the same data in a reanalysis and say that you have something else to say now. Can this change? Of course it can change. And some journals have already taken measures to try to make sharing routine. PLOS Medicine and BMJ, for example, in the last 4 years have asked for sharing of the raw data to be a precondition for publication for randomized trials. Along with Florian Odette, we tried to get hold of these data. We asked investigators to share them with us, and we told them that we're going to reanalyze them for the very same question that they had originally proposed them and used them. 46% of them did share their data, which is, I think, a very good proportion. It means that people were willing to provide that information to someone like me, who might have sounded like, I'm going to reanalyze your data and show that you're wrong, but they still did it. Nevertheless, did we find errors? A few, but none were such that they would invalidate the conclusions. The main conclusions were still pretty firm. What this can tell us, of course, is that this is a select sample into select journals from select authors who are willing to be open. But if we achieve that openness, probably we can reach situations where things would be reanalyzable and reproducible upon reanalysis. There's a countercurrent in lots of fields of research where people are not sharing and are even proud of not sharing. For example, the classic example is stealth research related to startups. Theranos was one such case, and when I was walking by their headquarters in 2014, I came across that building with that weird name, Theranos. In Greek, it sounded a bit like tyrannos, which is tyrant, or thanatos, which is death, and said, who is using that horrible name? I Googled them up, and it sounded fantastic. They have this wonderful technology that will disrupt all healthcare. They have the highest valuation at $9 billion than any startup in biomedicine in the world, and they can run testing 100 times faster, at 100 times more tests, 100 times less cost. Everything seemed better. But then I said, that's wonderful. I will collaborate with them. Let me find out what they have published. They had not published a single paper. So I sent a brief paper to JAMA. It went through a pretty extensive legal review, and when it came out, I concluded that I don't know if their valuation should be $9 billion, $90 billion, or $9, because exactly they haven't shown anything in the published world. About a year later, Wall Street Journal started coming out with lots of dreadful stories about what they were doing, or actually what they were not doing. Their technology was a complete fluke, and of course now that $9 billion has not become $9, it has become $0 because everything collapsed. One might think that this is a bad apple, but actually it is the norm. A few months ago, we looked at all the unicorns across biomedicine, and we realized that 50% have a profile that is very similar to Theranos. They just don't publish anything, they don't say anything, they don't share anything, but they say that they can disrupt the entire biomedicine. And last month, along with colleagues in immunology, we looked at the entire field of complement research, and we saw exactly the same pattern again. Lots of very influential research is following exactly the opposite direction in terms of transparency. Which one is dominant? Stealth or openness and sharing? A few years ago, when we looked at a random sample of the biomedical literature, everything seemed to be stealth. Nothing was being shared, with very, very few exceptions in pockets of genetics. When we repeated the exercise, 2015 to 2017, quite a bit was being shared. Some journals in some scientific fields have made sharing the norm, like psychological science went from 5% sharing to 40% sharing within a year of implementing a new policy, and now it's up to about 80% sharing. Across the entire biomedical literature, sharing has gone up from less than 1% to close to 25% in the last couple of years. Many other indicators of openness, like declaration of funding or conflicts of interest, have also improved. Many people are more willing to say that what they do is replication research rather than just trying to get something that's novel. And many people are sensitized about the need also to revolutionize the reproducibility of their computational tools. We need that because many of the computational tools that we use are very complex, and complexity is at inverse odds with transparency. The more complex tools we use, the more transparent we need to be able to communicate what exactly is happening, what exactly is being done, what exactly is being used. I will close with a couple of slides on incentives and rewards, because I think that they're very important for the overall transformation of science. This is a model of 11 equations that is trying to reproduce a universe of the scientific establishment, a universe of science, and I worked with that with David Grimes. What that model assumes is that there's 3 types of scientists. There's the diligent scientists, the careless scientists, and the unethical scientists. Now, how many are the unethical scientists? Fraud, as I said, is very, very rare. Let's say 1%. How many are those who are cutting corners, the careless ones? If you ask people, are you careless? The answer is no. If you ask them, are people in your vicinity careless? The answer is almost always yes. There's some. But what that model shows is that if all these 3 cohorts are rewarded the same for getting to a target, a product of a quote-unquote discovery, and then getting funded and getting progeny of fellows, the unethical and the non-diligent, the careless, will take over. And you don't need 11 differential equations for that. It's very simple. You need to do less work or no work and get the same result. So how do we incentivize the very best? How do we incentivize not just productivity, but also quality, reproducibility, sharing, and translational impact? I think that this is eventually where much of meta-research is heading, trying to find the best ways to reward the best science and to even understand what are the features that make up for that best of science. There's many ideas about that. This is a paper in PLOS Biology on hiring, promotion, and tenure that is trying to embed aspects of responsible indicators. There's another effort in the Hong Kong criteria that just came out recently based on the World Conference on Research Integrity. And I think that we need to move in that direction to incentivize the best of the best to happen in science. We need a revolution, and we need evolution. Science has always evolved. Science has always been a revolutionary process. There's many steps to attack in the process of transforming science. And there's many stakeholders that are involved that can make a difference. It's not just scientists. There's people who want to publish, people who want to get funding, people who want to make things work, translated, and people who want to make some profit so that they can keep things going. And we need to find ways to align all of them. To conclude, meta-research is assessing empirically the implementation of the scientific method and has the potential to improve and transform science at large. The reproducibility of many disciplines of scientific investigation has substantial room for improvement. There are many possible interventions that may improve the efficiency of research practices and the reproducibility of the evidence. And transparency, openness, and sharing are likely to help, but details on how to can be important. My bias then, we need more meta-research. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to lots of my collaborators.
So to ask the question, you just have to use a button in front of your desk, and you can.
Thank you for this excellent talk. You talked at some point of data sharing, and what would be good incentives to share data? I remember previous discussion in a former project where it was in medicine, and those who produced the data saw the only incentive as being co-authors of any study done with that data, which was not feasible. Whereas in other fields, just publishing the data is something you can do, and then you get lots of citations with that. But there's different ways of being rewarded, co-author or citations.
I think that it can operate at multiple levels, but I believe that at all levels we need to be transparent and be fair. As you say, a major motive in some fields was that sharing led to co-authorship. It led to papers that would hit higher impact venues compared to what each author could do alone with little slices of information. And that led to an inflation of both data shared, but also publications and perceived impact. So we have these fields that probably became much better in terms of sharing, but are now facing some inflated phenotypes of co-authorship that is not deserved, and of papers that probably don't have much meaning because they just keep being produced very massively. Different stakeholders could try to regulate this. Funders can make a difference in that regard because they can set the rules. They can say that from the very beginning, and many funders do that for many types of studies, that we only give you that money with the precondition that all the data needs to become available for widespread use. And they can also specify that this can happen or should happen pretty quickly within the frame of generation of the data and their analysis. I think that the entire perception of the community can also help. More and more scientists are sensitized that when they see a researcher who is more sharing, that researcher gets credit for his or her behavior. I think that this is really nice, as opposed to the past paradigm where someone was famous because he never shared any data and just published massively from that data set that no one ever saw. And there's lots of that still happening, of course. It's both individualized, funder, and community level perceptions. And I believe that we are moving in the right direction in changing these perceptions and the rules of the game.
Else?
Thank you, John, for also fantastic work again. For me, the point that data sharing should precede the rights of the data originators is a bit in conflict with the previous thought that you also shared with us, that it's very hard to really understand the data that someone else produced. And if everybody will start analyzing data like that have been shared before the originators have produced their own interpretation of it, I think they will all stumble on just so many errors that one finds. It seems impossible and also dangerous in order to have the right thing produced. So I wonder how you see the combination of these two features.
Yeah. You raise a very good point. I think that having more eyes look at data earlier on in their making is probably likely to yield more opportunities to detect errors, problems, validity issues. And ideally, if you do that even before the data are accumulated, then even the data collection and the quality of the information being assembled is likely to be best. Now, we do have lots of data that collect themselves without any of us doing anything. And some people are very fascinated about that happening. Some people believe that this type of data are the highest source of wealth in modern times. I do have my reservations about this. I think that, yes, sometimes these data may be effective modulators and sources of information, but other times they're likely to be very unreliable, as you say. So the level of control that we have varies a lot. I would argue that if we can optimize that control to the extent possible and acknowledge the lack of control in other situations and make it very transparent that these are data that we have no control on their assembly, collection, cleaning, or credibility, it will give us a better gradient of credibility and of what can be done with different types of data. So I don't think it's the premature sharing that hurts. I think it's the lack of thinking and the lack of having enough eyes and minds involved in the data generation, processing, cleaning, and sharing process.
Patrick?
Hi, John. My question is related to Elle's comment. So it's now a lot easier to do meta-analysis of individual patient data than it was 10 years ago, actually. For some, it became a sign of prestige. But then you move into the problem that you described about big data, data growing, with spurious associations based on actual flawed and badly readable codebooks. So wouldn't it be better in the future, actually, to advocate the use of parallel teams of the same data set rather than post hoc? So that, imagine there's a mechanism for actually two teams analyzing the same data and an adjudicator system, actually, obviously, because you shouldn't always publish two papers. And wouldn't that get away of a lot of spin, hype, and unreproducible results?
I like that idea, and there are several teams and several fields that are implementing parallel analysis of the same data by different analytical teams and then comparing notes and seeing whether they agree or not. For example, in genetics, this is something that is happening almost routinely in many of the large consortia. In my experience, once a field is pretty much set in its machinery and how that machinery should work, almost always these analytical teams get the same result. So it's unlikely that you will see a situation where some major error is introduced by one team and is picked by the other. It does happen, though, and I think that in many other fields where the machinery and the pipeline of what exactly is to be done here is not so clear-cut, then the degrees of analytical freedom that can be introduced are such that you can get a very different type of result, very wide spectrum of vibration of effects, as I call it, from people making different choices. Many of these choices being pretty valid, actually. So I cannot give like an answer yes or no, black or white. I think we need more experience with this type of parallel analysis. I think that some fields probably reach a saturation point where they know how things are to be done, and maybe you don't need that. Although by then, in many situations, it's so easy to do that maybe you can still do it. In other cases, probably we definitely need parallel analysis to just get a sense of how different the conclusions would be if you have different analysts looking at the same data. In the past, much of that seemed to be impossible or very time-consuming or just derailing the entire project. Right now, there are projects like the reproducibility effort for the Nature and Science papers that everything was pre-specified, everything was registered, the data set was available, an independent team could look at these data and reanalyze them within 30 minutes. So what used to be 30 months now can be done in 30 minutes.
Philippe?
Very nice talk, as usual. I fully agree with you about the importance of the bird's-eye view for the meta-research, but perhaps we need also a kind of micro-level applied on interventional meta-research at the level of each field, with people from the field working together to improve the field. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. There's that tension whether meta-research should be a detached, independent discipline or should be something that should have representatives within each field. And I'm trying to resist the temptation of saying that meta-research is a detached field that it should have just its own conferences and its own people and its own specialists, and these should have nothing to do with the other fields. I think that would be a disaster. I think meta-research, of course, is a field that is very dynamic and lots of people are working in it, but the maximal benefits is when you have scientists who are very experienced in doing work in specific fields, and they know what can go well and they know what can go wrong. They know what are the obstacles, they know what are the limitations, they know where they need that thrust of efficiency. And then you have a better chance, first, designing the best possible studies, second, finding interventions that do help, and third, achieving a grassroots movement within the field that you don't impose that as yet another bureaucratic external tyranny, but as something that is integral to the scientific health of the field. I think that meta-research is successful if it is successful to the extent that people are convinced that in their own science, not just as an external instigator, they need to take care of these issues.
Thank you for this talk. Today, researchers are more and more encouraged to generate data that could impact the society and to innovate. And at the same time, what we see from at the global level is that we encourage them to create their own companies and spin-off and so on. So I wonder how, I see a conflicting values here. How could they at the same time share data with the scientific community and be encouraged to create their spin-off companies, for example, where they would need to protect the data?
Yeah, so this is the tension exactly that I tried to describe. And I think that it has become completely polarized because companies, startups, they have that Theranos phenotype very often. And I think that more sharing can happen without jeopardizing the chances that that company will be successful. Actually, I would argue that more transparency and more sharing is necessary for a company to be successful in the long run. I think that the alternative would be just to have investors depend on just blind faith or some sort of trust and chance. And I have talked with lots of venture capitalists. They feel that pretty much they invest blindly, that they will invest in a portfolio of lots of companies and 1 out of 100 will be a success, 1 out of 1,000 will be a major success. I think we need more trust, more guidance from evidence in trying to make these decisions. And I think that people who use evidence, if the evidence is correct, if the evidence is transparent, if the evidence is trustworthy, are likely to make better decisions also at the company level, at the translation level, at the delivery of success stories. So it's something that we need also to couple with strict implementation of legislation that would protect patents and rights of companies who want to develop something. And most of these laws are out there. I mean, it's not that they do not exist. And we have lots of successful examples of companies who are sharing and very transparent and have very solid science behind what they try to achieve. So it's not utopian. I think that it should be mainstream, and it's happening already to a large extent.
Carl, the last question.
Thank you, John. Karel Moons from the Netherlands. John, I elaborate on a preceding question, the big data thing. And as you said, overnight, suddenly we have millions of observations. And it becomes harder. It's usually data that's not annotated. It's not coming from a pre-designed study with an overarching protocol or description. So we're not sure where the data come from. And you made a plea that we put more emphasis on replicating others' analysis, but we know how to analyze that data using machine algorithms and whatsoever. But do we know how to appraise that data? Do we know whether we understand what we're actually analyzing? Should we actually also put more effort in annotating and describing the data that suddenly comes into our analysis systems?
I'm all in favor of better processing and better quality and better annotation. And in a way, efficiency should not mean cutting corners to get there faster. It should mean optimizing our tools in order to get there faster, but also to get something that is credible. And I fully agree that lots of these data really require a lot of other types of investment to make them more meaningful and to raise their calibration of credibility. I would never argue to use immature data or data that are misleading just so that we use more.
The point only is we now know how to analyze it, but we seem to enter an era that we don't know what we analyze.
Yeah.
And that bothers me a bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that many fields actually that use this type of big data don't have a sense of calibration of what type of credibility they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And this means that we need even more work to try to understand that calibration. And most of the time, there's plenty of room to improve it. I think that most of these analyses really hover at the low bottom of credibility. You know, lots of noise and very little that is credible, let alone useful eventually.
So I think we can have, one.
Hi, John. Thank you for your talk. So I think something I see as an early career researcher as another barrier to sharing protocols, pre-registrations, data, materials, whatever, is education. And we've all been taught like how to write an article, but very few of us have probably been taught how to share data properly and code properly. So I'm wondering who should be responsible for this education and how could it be standardized?
I think that education is something that happens on a daily basis for every scientist, regardless of whether we're talking about an undergraduate, graduate student, master's student, PhD student, assistant professor, senior professor, retired professor, I don't know. It's a continuing education. And I think that education needs to be aligned with what we really do, because it's not just an issue of having one or a few courses about reproducible research practices and about research integrity and about methods, or a couple of statistics light courses, and then going to the lab or going to the field or your computer or your team and realizing that that's not how things run. I think that this is the greatest disappointment when especially young scientists see that disconnect between what they're told in some course and then what they see is the real life, everyday life of scientific investigation. So I would argue we need some rethinking and recast of what we educate people for. We are probably still paying a lot of attention on minor details, on some technical subject matter knowledge that is likely to disappear within a few years, as opposed to teaching processes and methods and ways to think and to protect yourself from bias. Some institutions will do that better, others probably less so. I think the ones that do it better probably will get the best scientists, and the scientists who continue to invest in this type of education, learning from their own mistakes in the process, are likely to be the best.
Paula, sorry, yeah.
Thanks. Oh, thank you. Paula Williamson, University of Liverpool. So, as you all know, John, as many of us know, Doug Altman said we need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And as many of us know, funding can drive behaviour. So we're trying to lobby funders. We think to do better research, we need more methods research. Okay? And we're trying to lobby funders for more funding for methods research. I could do with your help. Which way should we go? Do we want pots of money specifically for methods research, or do we want to embed methods research in all of the substantive research that's going on? Or do we need both? How do we persuade funders that methods research is really important?
I fundamentally agree with what you say, that we need more methods research and more methods research funded. I have a strong bias for that, of course. Which is the best way to do it, embed it into fields or have it kind of detached? There's no randomized trial on this. Both sound great. I think all of us who work on methods would be welcoming this type of more major investment. And I think that intuitively, I think that both could have utility. I think that embedding research into real problems is useful because there's more urgency, there's more direct impact, there's more understanding of what is at stake and what we know, what we don't know, what we need to fix. Some research that is probably not embedded into specific problems, that is taking a broader view that may apply to multiple problems, I think is also necessary. And I think that this is the toughest at the moment to fund in many environments. In my experience, I have very often tried to piggyback methods research, as you suggest, into projects that are dealing with a specific subject matter, and people are willing to do that. But when you try to say that I'm trying to do something that would affect multiple fields, then obviously this is making a strong claim. People may think you're crazy or a Napoleon kind of a grandiose paranoia, but I think that that's also useful to have. So I will take any type of support for methods research.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, one more. This will be the last one.
First, thank you for your talk. I would like to ask you regarding if you think that besides replication, we have any chance by identifying these gaps in research, by having this overview of research, if we can try and better support the decision of the research initiation to decide the project in which we are going to fund, for instance, and if you think that these gaps are, and how much they are actually impacting the healthcare guidelines that we now have and levels of recommendation for the healthcare practice.
Which guidelines?
In general, practice guidelines for the healthcare system in cardiology and different specialties.
Yeah, I didn't talk at all about guidelines because it's a huge topic, but obviously guidelines are their own world with zillions of problems and inefficiencies and difficulties of translating evidence into recommendations and huge conflicts and lots of red flags in the majority of them. About 90% of guidelines probably I would not trust at all. The question is, how do we improve that 10% that is trustworthy, and how do we also connect guidelines better with the reasoning about generating research that matters and that can then inform them more meaningfully?
I would like to thank you very much, John, for this fantastic talk, very inspiring, and for answering all the audience questions. Thank you so much.